On the night of August 29th, 2002, 31-year-old Audrey Herron finished her nursing shift in Catskill, New York, and headed home. But she never arrived, leaving behind a dark mystery. Audrey, a mother of three, left work around 11 p.m., wearing her dark green medical scrubs and a blue turtleneck, and drove off in her black 1994 Jeep Grand Cherokee. She planned to make the roughly 15-mile trip from the Greene County Healthcare Facility in Jefferson Heights back to her home in Freehold. This was a drive that should have taken at maximum 30 minutes. That late summer evening was rainy and foggy, which may have prompted Audrey to consider an alternate route for safety. By 11:30 p.m., her family expected her to walk through the door, but Audrey Herron vanished without a trace, along with the entire SUV she was driving. More than 20 years later, her disappearance remains an unsettling mystery. Audrey's last known actions were utterly routine. There were no signs of distress as she departed from work, and in fact, it had been a good day for Audrey. She'd received news of a substantial pay raise at work and had excitedly phoned her husband Jeff earlier to share the good news. When midnight came and went with no sign of Audrey, Jeff initially wasn't alarmed. According to some reports, he woke up briefly around 2 a.m. and noticed his wife still hadn't returned. But it wasn't until dawn that concern truly set in. By 6 o'clock in the morning on August 30th, Jeff began calling around. He phoned Audrey's mother, Shirley Olmsted, hoping perhaps Audrey had decided to spend the night at her mom's on a whim. It wasn't unusual for Audrey to occasionally stay over with her mother, but if she had, she would have let her husband know first. Shirley hadn't seen or heard from Audrey either, and within the next hour, worry turned into action, and Audrey was officially reported missing. Law enforcement wasted no time launching a search for the missing nurse and her vehicle. Police and volunteers fanned out across the area, covering nearly 120 miles of roads, backcountry routes, and trails looking for any sign of Audrey's black Jeep. Helicopters buzzed overhead as authorities scanned the thick forests and fields of Greene County from above. Missing person flyers bearing Audrey's face were posted throughout local communities, and everyone who may have seen her in the region would have been aware of her status. From the outset, there were no easy clues to be found. There were no broken guardrails along the route she likely took, no skid marks or debris, and not a single trace of the Jeep Grand Cherokee she was driving. Adding to concerns, Audrey's personal items had effectively gone silent as well, and her cell phone never pinged any towers, and her credit card saw no activity after she left work. The New York State Police soon classified Audrey's case as missing under suspicious circumstances, meaning foul play was a strong possibility. As in any disappearance, investigators took a hard look at those closest to Audrey. Naturally, Jeff Herron, Audrey's husband, was questioned extensively. Early news reports noted that Jeff initially declined a police request to take a polygraph test in the weeks after his wife went missing. Notably, as anyone familiar with true crime stories knows, there are a number of great reasons not to want to take a polygraph test, even if you're completely innocent. However, after he was labeled as uncooperative by the authorities, he eventually caved and took the lie detector test. After this test, and extensive searches of the family property on multiple occasions, the authorities advised that he was no longer a suspect in her disappearance. With the obvious suspect essentially ruled out, the cops began to dig deeper into Audrey's life, and what they found was disturbingly ordinary. There were no secret affairs, no hidden problems with substances, no clandestine entanglements with shady individuals. She was a great employee and a stellar mother of 3 children, and everyone who the authorities interviewed insisted she would never intentionally leave her kids behind. Interestingly, her children remembered her as such a good mother that according to an interview from 2025 I was able to find, Two of them were inspired to become nurses as well. In the absence of hard evidence, numerous theories have emerged about what could have happened on Audrey's drive home. Investigators and family have grappled with possibilities ranging from accident to abduction. One of the first possibilities considered was that Audrey wrecked her Jeep that night, skidding off the road due to the foggy, rainy conditions. Perhaps she took a back road detour to avoid bad weather and ended up in a ravine or a body of water where her vehicle simply hasn't been spotted. This theory gained traction because it's exceedingly rare for a vehicle as large as a Jeep Grand Cherokee to completely vanish without a trace. Despite extensive searches by ground and air, no trace has ever been found, leading some to doubt a simple accident. Still, police have treated this possibility seriously, and even in recent years they have sent dive teams to search local waters. For instance, in May 2022, the New York State Police Underwater Recovery Team scoured 3 Greene County water bodies for evidence of Audrey's Jeep, but came up empty-handed. The complete lack of any debris or oil slicks after countless searches has made the accident theory seem less likely to many, but it can't be ruled out. Ultimately, the area she disappeared in has numerous bodies of water, and a search of 3 lakes is nothing in the grand scheme of things. Some have considered the possibility that she met with foul play at the hands of someone lying in wait. According to Shirley Olmsted, Audrey's mother, Audrey had a habit of leaving her car door unlocked. This theory suggests that someone snuck in and lay in wait with the intent of doing serious harm to Audrey. Under this theory, this person may have been a stalker who had become fixated on Audrey, perhaps completely unbeknownst to her. Another theory is that Audrey was the victim of a chance encounter with the wrong person on the road. This area of upstate New York is generally peaceful and quiet, but it's not impossible that a stranger could have crossed paths with Audrey after she left work. One possibility is that she might have stopped if she saw someone in distress on the roadside, given her helpful nursing instincts, only to fall into a trap. Alternatively, a stranger could have intentionally caused her to stop or forced her vehicle off the road. However, without any 911 calls, witness sightings, or evidence left behind, this theory is impossible to substantiate. Although never labeled a suspect, Jeff Herron has unavoidably been part of the conversation in Audrey's case. While there has been continued focus on Jeff amongst online sleuths, the reality is that the authorities have confirmed that there is no evidence of wrongdoing by the husband. Notably, he didn't help in the search efforts, which some people find highly unusual, and quite honestly, I do as well. All that said, having covered so many of these cases, I find that in cases where the husband did it, he's usually very much out there and involved in the search effort. After all, this serves a dual purpose of appearing to be the perfect grieving spouse, along with also obtaining intel about the efforts made by search teams. The investigation into Audrey Herron's disappearance remains active, albeit as a cold case. Law enforcement agencies, led by the New York State Police, continue to follow leads as they emerge. In 1946, the quiet communities along Oregon's Willamette River were shaken by a gruesome discovery that would become one of the state's most perplexing cold cases. Over the course of that year, dismembered remains surfaced in and around the river near Oak Grove, just south of Portland. The victim, an unidentified woman, came to be known only as the Oak Grove Jane Doe, and in the years following, her remains went missing. Nearly 80 years later, her case remains unsolved, but advances in forensic science and persistent investigators are still striving to piece together what happened. And trust me when I say it, this case just had the most unexpected and bizarre twist in September 2025, which will almost certainly lead to her identity being restored. On April 12, 1946, three friends walking along the east bank of the Willamette River near Oak Grove stumbled upon a strange burlap sack caught in the river. Drawn by curiosity and a foul odor, they dragged the bundle ashore, initially thinking it might contain drowned animals. To their horror, inside they found the torso of a human female along with clothing, all tightly wrapped with rope and wire and weighted down. This shocking find was quickly reported to authorities, and a full-on search of the area began. The very next day, April 13, 1946, more body parts surfaced. Two fishermen at Willamette Falls, a few miles upriver, retrieved another burlap bundle that had been floating near a lock system. Inside were the victim's arms and a thigh, also severed and weighted down in similar fashion to the first package. The fishermen later revealed they had seen that burlap parcel bobbing in the water for weeks, but only upon hearing news of the torso did they realize its significance. Investigators scoured the muddy banks near the falls and even made plaster casts of footprints found near where the bundle might have been thrown into the water. The search for the woman's remains continued throughout 1946 as spring turned to summer and fall. In late July 1946, roughly 3 months after the initial discoveries, the victim's other thigh was found floating under a bridge near Oregon City, further downstream. Around the same time, detectives recovered bundles of women's clothing from the nearby Clackamas River, a tributary of the Willamette. The scattering of body parts and personal items across two rivers led police to suspect the perpetrator had tried to dispose of evidence in multiple places to confuse investigators. In September, there was a report of what appeared to be a fragment of scalp retrieved. Finally, on October 13, 1946, the victim's head was discovered in the river, not far from where the torso had initially been found. This package, like the others, had been weighted and wrapped, and was spotted by a local couple walking along the water's edge. Despite extensive searches, the woman's hands and feet were never recovered. By year's end, authorities had collected nearly the entire body of the unknown victim, in pieces, from the Oregon waterways. From the moment the remains were found, police and medical experts worked to assemble a profile of the victim and clues to her death. Initially, she was described as being in her late teens or early 20s by a local coroner. However, the authorities had some doubts and sent the remains to a forensic pathologist. His analysis revealed the victim was actually a middle-aged Caucasian woman, likely between 40 and 50 years old with a moderate build. This further medical examination uncovered disturbing details about the crime. The lower portion of the torso had unusual burn marks that appeared to be caused by a blowtorch. Once the skull was recovered and examined, the cause was determined. The victim had suffered a massive blunt force trauma injury to the head. Authorities believed that the dismemberment took place after this occurred, but given the signs of violence, they couldn't say for sure. Notably, within days of the torso's discovery, the case attracted not only concerned citizens but also pranksters and false confessors. On April 14, 1946, a man in a nearby town phoned police claiming he knew the victim's identity and where the crime had happened. This dramatic confession turned out to be a hoax by an attention seeker, which authorities quickly dismissed as a cruel prank. The case captured some national headlines, which only encouraged more of this sort of behavior, and credible leads were non-existent. Evidence collection in the 40s lacked many of the advantages of modern forensics, yet the investigators did what they could. They traced the burlap sacks and ropes for any identifying marks, and examined the woman's clothing for laundry labels or distinctive features. Despite these attempts, the investigation ended up stalling out, and by the early 50s, the Oak Grove Jane Doe case had gone cold. Crucially, many physical pieces of evidence disappeared from police custody. At some point in the 1950s, the victim's remains and other critical evidence were lost or destroyed without any clear documentation and for no apparent reason. This included the bones and skull of the Jane Doe herself, which had been retained for analysis. How such evidence went missing remains an unsettling mystery of its own, and one that has led to rumors of a cover-up, but I'll come to that in a moment. With no body to examine and only old case files to work from, investigators in later years had little to go on. Despite these challenges, the case was never completely forgotten. In 2004, the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office formally reopened the Oak Grove Jane Doe investigation, treating it as an active cold case review. Detectives revisited the old reports and searched for any remaining evidence that might have been overlooked. Unfortunately, they ran into the same problem of the evidence simply having been destroyed. Then a breakthrough came from an unexpected direction: an old cemetery record. In September 2025, nearly 79 years after the slaying, officials with the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office made a startling discovery. While combing through historical burial documents and even crowdsourced grave databases, they found a reference to an unidentified woman buried in 1951. The name on the headstone indicated that she was, quote, "Unknown Woman, 1946." The burial site was in Mountain View Cemetery in Oregon City, not far from where the last of the remains had been found. This clue suggested that some portion of the Jane Doe's remains had indeed been interred locally, presumably after the initial investigation concluded. Acting quickly on this lead, authorities located the grave and, on September 22, 2025, exhumed the remains of the woman in the grave for forensic analysis. This exhumation marked the first tangible progress in the case in almost 80 years. Given this development, I anticipate that the authorities will be able to use modern genetic genealogical techniques to give this woman her identity back after 80 years. With her identity returned, this will also present a unique opportunity to solve this cold case. There are a lot of sensationalistic theories out there on who this Jane Doe was in life. One of the most discussed theories in recent years is that the victim may have been Anna Schrader, a Portland woman who indeed vanished around 1946. Anna Schrader's background suggests she was a one-time police informant and the mistress of a Portland cop in the 1920s. According to some researchers, she had publicly claimed she had kept records of all the corruption in the Portland Police Department. Intriguingly, in April 1946, the same time the Jane Doe's remains began appearing, a classified ad ran in the Oregonian newspaper seeking information on Ann Schrader. And no, you didn't hear me incorrectly there. I said Ann and not Anna. It's unclear if these two are the same individual or not, and Schrader isn't an uncommon name. And personally, I think the name rocks. I'll just insert a little pause there to let that one sink in. I suspect that sometime over the next year, we'll have word on whether this Jane Doe was Anna Schrader or not. For now, though, we have to play the waiting game while those forensic wizards do their thing. Hey everyone, Jimmy reminding you to like and subscribe and to tap the notification bell and click the share button and send it around to your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill True Crime, if you're into solved crime cases. On a clear, sunny morning in March 1876, residents of rural Bath County, Kentucky witnessed one of the strangest downpours in history. It was a shower of meat falling from the sky. Around 11 on March 3rd, a farmer's wife named Mrs. Crouch was outdoors making soap when she suddenly saw chunks of raw flesh plummet to the ground around her. For a few minutes, pieces of bloody meat, some as light as snowflakes, others several inches across, rained over the Crouch farm, sticking to fences and grass in a broad area. Stunned and frightened, The Crouches suspected this uncanny deluge might be a divine omen or supernatural warning. By the time this bizarre Kentucky meat shower ended, it had strewn the ground with what looked like butcher's scraps across their farm. The farmers initially thought that the meat was beef, but they decided to take it over to a local butcher. The butcher in turn said that it definitely wasn't beef, and that while it looked like mutton, it didn't smell like it at all. A hunter, catching word of what had happened, asked to inspect the meat, and came to the conclusion that it was from a bear. Word of mouth about the meat shower was spreading rapidly, and it would soon hit the local news and then go national in the New York Times. From there, the meat shower captured the attention of legitimate scientists, and a number of samples were sent around the country for further analysis. Early explanations for the meat shower ranged from scientific curiosity to the bizarre. One initial hypothesis was that the material wasn't meat at all, but rather dried frog eggs or spawn that had been whisked into the air by winds and then fallen back down. This idea lost traction once microscopic examination revealed organized muscle fibers, which was clear evidence of animal tissue, not amorphous amphibian jelly. Another proposal suggested in a journal article that the meat was actually nostoc, a type of gelatinous algae-like bacteria that can swell into fleshy lumps after rain. However, this theory was quickly undermined by the facts of the case. The meat shower occurred under clear skies with no rain to trigger nostoc, and several scientists found that the samples undeniably had the cellular structure of animal flesh. In short, whatever fell on the Crouch farm was genuine meat, not a plant or pond slime masquerading as meat. As more samples arrived at laboratories, researchers began to characterize exactly what kind of meat had fallen and from where. Before long, investigators arrived at a plausible answer. The leading theory is that the meat had fallen from the stomachs of vultures flying overhead. Bath County was home to scavenging birds like turkey vultures, and these birds are notorious for vomiting their food as a defensive tactic or when they need to lighten their load. In fact, if one vulture in a flock regurgitates, it can trigger a chain reaction causing its companions to disgorge as well. In 1876, local experts pointed out that this buzzard blast scenario neatly fit the evidence. A flock of vultures might have been feasting on a dead animal, say a sheep, which would explain the mutton-like smell, and then something startled them. The startled birds then collectively regurgitated the half-digested meal mid-flight onto the Crouch farm. The gory payload would then scatter in the wind and fall to the ground as a rain of flesh and organs. Though no one actually saw the birds overhead at the time, the notion that a flock of nauseated vultures caused the incident was considered the most reasonable explanation. Other common explanations at the time focused on it being a supernatural event, or even if it wasn't supernatural, that it was an omen of things to come. And honestly, there's something extremely ominous about a sheep carcass raining down from the sky in bits regardless. I seriously wonder what an augur from Roman antiquity would have had to say about that sort of event. Notably, the meat from this event has been preserved, and as genetic testing improves on degraded specimens, we will one day know the origin of the meat. That, of course, doesn't prove the vulture theory, but it will provide some answer to exactly what animal rained down on the Crouch farm in the late 19th century. On July 18, 1988, 64-year-old Jane Gilboy, a longtime resident of Franklin, Massachusetts, was found brutally slain in her own home. Despite the passage of more than 35 years, authorities continue to actively pursue leads in this unsolved case, determined to obtain justice for Jane. Jane Gilboy was by all accounts an ordinary, hard-working woman. She lived in Franklin with her long-term boyfriend, held a job as a bookkeeper at Camger Chemical in nearby Norfolk, and also worked part-time keeping books for a local liquor store. Just prior to the tragedy, she had enjoyed a weekend getaway on Cape Cod with a friend, returning home Sunday evening, July 17th, 1988. The next day, Monday, July 18th, began routinely for Jane. She went to work as usual and clocked out around 4 p.m. to drive home, following her normal route through Norfolk into Franklin. As was her habit, she stopped at the Horace Mann Plaza in Franklin to pick up a newspaper and some items before heading home. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary during her commute, and it appeared to be a typical summer afternoon for Jane. Sometime shortly after 4:15 p.m., Jane arrived at her house at 783 King Street in Franklin and parked in her usual spot in the driveway. She entered through the rear door of her home, likely carrying the newspaper and items she'd just bought, and stepped inside. Tragically, Jane only made it a few steps into her living room before she was violently attacked from behind. Evidence later showed that she was ambushed almost immediately after entering. The assailant struck with brutal force, inflicting a severe beating and slashing Jane's throat during the assault. Her fully clothed body was discovered on the floor, with her house keys dropped near her hand. It was Jane's boyfriend who found her later that same day. He arrived home in the early evening and stumbled upon the horrific scene, then urgently called for an ambulance shortly after 6 o'clock. First responders rushed to the house, but it was immediately clear that Jane was already deceased and that her death was the result of extreme violence. Aside from the devastation wrought on Jane herself, the crime scene didn't initially reveal many clues. Notably, the only item reported missing from the home was Jane's purse. There were no obvious signs of ransacking or a prolonged struggle throughout the house, and the attack had been swift and focused. The fact that Jane's purse was gone raised the possibility of a robbery, but nothing else of value appeared to be taken. Franklin police, along with the Massachusetts State Police, launched an intensive investigation immediately. From the outset, it was a challenging case, and there was no known eyewitness to the attack, and, in the immediate aftermath, no obvious suspect emerged. Investigators naturally interviewed Jane's boyfriend and others close to her, but no one was charged or officially named a suspect in those early days. In fact, even decades later, authorities have never publicly identified any individual as a prime suspect or person of interest in this case. Notably, Jane's boyfriend was at work at the time of the attack and appears to have had an airtight alibi. At any rate, even if he was the responsible party, which all evidence says he was not, he passed away a few years later. Over time, as the trail grew cold, the case became what authorities prefer to call unresolved rather than truly closed. Detectives continued to work the case for years, periodically reviewing evidence and re-interviewing anyone who might know something. A major development in the Gilboy investigation came in 2003, about 15 years after the attack. Detectives decided to submit a blood sample from the crime scene for DNA testing, hoping that modern forensic science might provide a break in the case. At the time, officials were tight-lipped about specifics, saying only that the results were, quote, not as expected. In the immortal words of Bart Simpson, what an odd thing to say. This cryptic statement suggests that the sample was too degraded, or it turned out to be Jane's, or it didn't match any profile on record, and more on that last point in a second. Whatever the case, the DNA analysis did not lead to an arrest or any public breakthrough. Now I have a completely speculative idea on why they may have issued this statement, and I'm not really basing this on anything here. But I suspect that there's a non-zero chance that there may have been a DNA sample from an unknown woman recovered from the scene. Such brutal random attacks are very rarely committed by a female attacker, and given how tight-lipped the investigators are, I suspect they may not want to release this information. That said, Again, this idea is completely speculative on my part, but it would explain the very unusual and cryptic behavior of the investigators. For example, if it was from her boyfriend, who was then deceased, I imagine they would have just come out and released that information, even if it was unexpected. With no arrests and scant publicly revealed evidence, the slaying of Jane Gilboy has prompted speculation about who eliminated her and why. Investigators have kept many details confidential, but they have provided some insight that guides the leading theories. Notably, the extreme violence of the attack and the relatively minor apparent theft suggest that robbery was not the primary motive. The police have gone on record as believing this to be the case, and it tracks well, since you really don't see this level of brutality in thefts in general. Many believe instead that it was a targeted personal attack perpetrated on Jane. This is the theory that I personally subscribe to as well. Under this theory, the ferocity of the beating and throat slashing indicates rage or intent beyond what would be needed to incapacitate a victim for the purposes of a purse snatching. This indicates that there may have been someone in Jane's life who bore an incredible grudge against her. However, the investigators are extremely tight-lipped about this case, which makes it hard to analyze whether this was the case or not. Others have speculated that the attack might have been the work of a stalker who essentially chose to target Jane at random. What is known is that the attacker clearly struck immediately as she entered the house. This suggests to some that the attacker may have been extremely familiar with her schedule and lurking nearby the entrance to her house. After all these years, Jane Gilboy's case remains unsolved, but it is far from a forgotten cold case. Investigators today emphasize that they consider it an active but unresolved case, meaning they are waiting for the right evidence or tip to finally crack it. Modern forensic techniques may offer renewed hope, and it's always possible that the cryptic surprise from the first DNA attempt in 2003 was that it was too degraded. Modern forensic technology has come a long way since that time, and it's possible that this may be the clue that closes out this tragedy once and for all. For centuries in the foothills of the Pyrenees, in southern France and North Spain, an extraordinary secret lay hidden in plain sight. It revealed itself only when patterns in local family trees began to emerge. These families came from long lines of humble carpenters, basket makers, and rope makers, almost always relegated to the wrong parts of town. Beneath the surface was a 1,000-year-old story of a cursed and unique people. They were known as the Cagos, and their history is one of relentless stigma. Despite being genetically, linguistically, and religiously indistinguishable from their neighbors, they were cast out and treated as untouchables. For nearly a millennium, the only thing setting them apart was their descent from other Cagos. Their story raises haunting questions. Who were the Cagos, and why were they condemned so completely for reasons that not even their persecutors could clearly define? To be a Cago was to live a life governed by invisible boundaries and ritualized humiliation. From birth until death, every aspect of their existence was segregated, policed by a complex system of rules designed to enforce their status as quote-unquote unclean. The physical separation began with their homes. Cagos were confined to their own ghettos, which were invariably situated on the least desirable land. These were neighborhoods outside the main village walls, often on the far side of a river or in malarial marshlands. These areas were seen as being a safe distance from the markets, taverns, and shops of the rest of the population. This physical distance was reinforced by a litany of prohibitions built on a logic of contamination. It was believed that the Cagos were pestilential, their very touch capable of poisoning the world around them. They were forbidden from walking the common roads barefoot, lest they taint the earth. They couldn't touch the parapets of bridges, drink from public fountains, or enter taverns where other people drank. To handle food or wine in the market was a crime, and they were barred from owning livestock or farming the land. In one horrific instance in the early 18th century, a Cago who dared to try to farm was punished by having his feet impaled. There are many such instances of this disturbing cruelty perpetrated on these people by their neighbors. To ensure they could be identified at a glance, Cagos were forced to wear a badge. And I need to emphasize at this point that they looked identical to the people who surrounded them in every way, though some rumors would say this was only because of their dark magic. But back to the badge. This was a piece of red or yellow cloth, cut into the shape of a goose or duck's foot, sewn conspicuously onto their clothing. This mark, which earned them the derogatory nickname canards, or ducks en français, and served as a constant visible reminder of their status. Anyone found without their badge faced fines, or the confiscation of their clothes, or potentially even worse. In some regions, the parallels with another feared group were made explicit. Cagos were required to carry a wooden rattle, or claquette, to announce their approach, the same tool used by lepers to warn others to keep their distance. This practice cemented the association with disease in the public mind, even when there was no evidence to support it. Barred from nearly all professions, especially those involving food or agriculture, the Cagos were funneled into a narrow set of trades. They became the community's woodworkers, carpenters, barrel makers, rope makers, and tellingly, coffin makers. They were the hewers of wood for the towns they lived in. This restriction created a profound irony, and Cagos became highly skilled craftsmen, particularly as carpenters. Their labor was in high demand, and they were often the ones who built the magnificent wooden roofs and doors of the very churches that would become the sites of their greatest humiliation. They were simultaneously indispensable to the community for their skills and utterly rejected by it as people, a paradox that highlights the contradictory logic of their persecution. Nowhere was the Cagos' status as inclusive outcasts more apparent than in the house of God. Their treatment in church remains their most tangible legacy, etched into the very stone of dozens of chapels. They were forbidden from using the main entrance, instead being forced through small, low side doors. These doors required them to stoop over and virtually crawl into church, where their humiliation continued. They were confined to the coldest, darkest corners of the church, separated from the main congregation by a wooden railing. The ultimate degradation came during communion. They were often forbidden from partaking at all, especially by priests who had grown up in regions with these people. When priests would pass the Eucharist to them, it was a disturbing spectacle that caused disgust to outsiders who observed it. The Eucharist was passed to them on the end of a long wooden spoon or stick, as if feeding a dangerous animal. For centuries, historians have tried to pinpoint a reason for the relentless persecution of the Cagos. The sheer variety and outlandishness of the theories reveal more about the nature of prejudice than they do about the Cagos themselves. The search for a single origin is a hunt for a rational explanation for an irrational hatred. The most common and enduring explanation was that Cagos were the descendants of medieval lepers. This theory seemed logical, as it would explain the obsession with contamination and the similarities in treatment, such as the use of rattles. However, the historical record tells a different story, and hospital records of the time in southern France indicated that they forbid entry to Cagos, whether they were sick or not. The implication of these records is that it was accepted that there were Cagos who definitely weren't sick. Another set of theories cast the Cagos as the descendants of defeated enemies, their cursed status a kind of inherited treason. One theory suggests that they were the remnants of Muslim armies from the 8th century, though no evidence supports this. For instance, the names of Kagos are identical to those of their neighbors, and they adhered to all the same traditions, showing no signs of having originally been converts. Another theory suggests they are survivors of the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathar heresy. This explanation was strategically used by the Kagos themselves in a 1514 appeal to Pope Leo X, advising that they were very orthodox in their Catholic practice. However, like the other theories on their origin, this one crumbles under scrutiny. Historical records show Kago communities existed long before the Cathar heresy and in regions where it never took hold. Where history failed to provide a reason, myth and folklore rushed in to fill the void. Fantastical stories cast the Kagos as a people cursed by God himself. They were said to be descended from the carpenters who built the cross for Christ's crucifixion, which appeared to provide an explanation for why they were so good with wood. Notably, the description of what a Kago looked like is wildly inconsistent. Some said that they exclusively had blonde hair and blue eyes and were tall, while others said they were dark and swarthy and tended to be shorter. Others said that their true appearance was much more disturbing and that they had the ability to use powerful magic to alter their appearance and fit in with the regular population. In essence, though, the purpose of these stories wasn't to describe reality as it existed, but to dehumanize a class of people. After stripping away the layers of myth, failed historical theories, and rationalizations, we are left with a stark and unsettling conclusion. There was no original sin, and the only consistent, verifiable reason a person was a Kago was because their parents were Kagos. Their persecution was a tautology. They were hated because they were Kagos, and they were Kagos because they were hated. This system was maintained not by any visible difference, but by the meticulous record-keeping of local communities, particularly parish priests, who logged every birth and baptism. A Kago who moved to a new village could be easily identified by a letter from their former priest, and thus the persecution would continue. Despite centuries of oppression, the Kagos weren't merely passive victims. As mentioned briefly, in 1514 they banded together and appealed to the Pope, an Italian, who appears to have been confused as to why they were being persecuted. Kagos only existed as a class in southern France and in Basque country under the Spanish crown, and he was likely unfamiliar with them as a class. The Pope issued a decree that Kagos were good Christians and ought not to be treated any differently either in church or in society in general. It's unclear how much impact this had on the ground at the time, since local parish priests weren't writing up reports on this class of outcasts. Further, of course, parish priests weren't supposed to be discriminating against them to begin with, so the Pope's decree was really just a restatement of canon law as it stood anyway. In France, Kagos went before regional parliaments to challenge their segregation from the rest of the populace. One famous case in Toulouse dragged on for 40 years before the court finally decreed in 1600 that the Kagos were not lepers and shouldn't be treated as such. Interestingly, this also provides one data point to indicate that after it became clear that the Pope didn't want them to be discriminated against on religious grounds, the reasons changed. They were simply treated as lepers, and as such, by the logic of the time, they needed to be kept apart, despite what the Pope said about their practice of Catholicism. The true turning point came with the French Revolution in 1789. The revolution's ideals of liberty and equality legally abolished all discriminatory laws against the Kagos, granting them, at least on paper, the full rights of citizenship. But the Kagos understood something profound about their condition. Their curse wasn't just a matter of law or social custom, It was written down in ink. Their oppression was bureaucratic, enshrined in the baptismal records and parish registers that had tracked their quote-unquote unclean lineage for centuries. During the chaos of the revolution, Cagos across the region took direct action. They stormed town halls and parish archives, seeking out the documents which proved their status and burned them. This was a targeted assault on the administrative machinery of their persecution. By destroying the official records, they were destroying the state's ability to see and enforce their hereditary status ever again. This act of liberation through erasure proved more effective than all the papal proclamations and royal decrees that had come before it. The destruction of the archives, combined with the new legal equality granted by the revolution, finally allowed the walls of the ghettos to crumble. Through the 19th and into the 20th century, the Cagos began to slowly assimilate. Intermarriage with non-Cagos became possible, and families moved away, changed their names, and shed the identity that had brought them nothing but suffering. The distinct Cago culture, forged in the crucible of persecution, simply vanished. In the end, the mystery of why these people were persecuted remains entirely unsolved. In the early 1980s, Roger Wheeler spent millions buying a business that he hoped would be the basis for his sports empire. What he didn't know is that this purchase meant that he had entered into a fatal entanglement with the Boston mob and Whitey Bulger, one of the most feared gangsters in American history. Wheeler was a self-made multimillionaire who came from humble beginnings, who had established himself as a well-known figure in Tulsa, Oklahoma. By 1981, the 55-year-old father of five had built a business empire, notably as the chairman of Telex, a communications company that employed thousands in the Tulsa area. Wheeler had a reputation as a shrewd, confident businessman who thrived on competition and always seemed to come out on top. Beyond Telex, he had diversified his ventures, and a few years earlier, he made a fateful decision. He purchased World High Lie, a Florida-based gaming and sports entertainment company. At first glance, World High Lie might have seemed like an exciting new opportunity. High Lie is a fast-paced sport that was popular in parts of Florida and New England, drawing crowds who enjoyed betting on the games. As the new owner and president, Wheeler aimed to legitimize and grow the business and attract mainstream audiences to the game. However, what he didn't know was that the organization he purchased was harboring an extremely dark secret. Behind the scenes, an organized crime group from Boston, the Winter Hill Gang, led by the notorious James Whitey Bulger, had infiltrated the company. They were running a lucrative skimming scheme, siphoning off cash from the operation's proceeds, particularly from parking lot revenues and concessions. The scheme was made possible by an inside man, H. Paul Rico, a former FBI agent who had retired and taken a job as head of security for the organization. As a former FBI man, Roger Wheeler initially trusted Rico implicitly in what would turn out to be a grave mistake right from the start. Rico had once cultivated Bulger and other mobsters as informants in Boston, and now he was helping them line their pockets by stealing from Wheeler's new venture. Roger Wheeler wasn't someone to let money slip away unnoticed, and within a couple of years of buying World High Lie, he grew suspicious. He noticed irregularities in the financial records, profits that didn't add up, and cash that vanished before it could be reported. Wheeler voiced concerns that something wasn't right at the company, and he even confided to family that he was considering selling the business, sensing deeper problems. In early 1981, he fired several key employees at the company's Connecticut and Florida operations, including financial officers, suspecting them of involvement in an embezzlement ring. He sent his own son on a discreet trip to Florida to inspect the books and the computer systems for evidence of theft. Wheeler's relentless probing into the company's affairs signaled to Rico that the scheme was in jeopardy. The Winter Hill Gang ended up catching wind of this and decided to eliminate the problem at its source. On May 27, 1981, a sunny Wednesday afternoon in Tulsa, Roger stuck to his routine. Each week, he enjoyed a round of golf at the exclusive Southern Hills Country Club, where he was a prominent member. That day, Wheeler played golf with friends, had his usual drink at the clubhouse, and then headed to the parking lot to leave. He walked to his Cadillac, likely tired from the game, but relaxed in the familiar comfort of his club. As he sat in the driver's seat, something unexpected and horrifying happened. A man approached the car and, without any warning or chance for Wheeler to react, raised a weapon and fired a single blast at point-blank range through the window. The bullet struck Roger Wheeler between the eyes. Club patrons nearby heard a loud crack echo across the lot, but no one immediately investigated what was going on. By the time anyone realized what happened, the shooter had calmly walked away. Within minutes, club staff and friends rushed to Wheeler's Cadillac. They found him slumped in the front seat, unresponsive. Paramedics and police were called, but there was little anyone could do. Roger Wheeler died at the scene, the victim of a professional job. Tulsa police launched an investigation immediately, but they faced a perplexing mystery. Who would want Roger Wheeler dead, and why? Initially, detectives looked for local enemies or business disputes that might have led to this brutal act. Wheeler was powerful and straightforward. Perhaps someone held a grudge from a business deal gone bad. Yet, from the start, signs pointed away from the typical motives. This was a meticulous, calculated slaying by an unknown assailant who appeared to vanish without a trace. One of the Tulsa detectives assigned to the case quickly sensed this wasn't a simple local crime. The method, a single shot between the eyes, and the lack of obvious personal motive, suggested a pro had been retained. There were composite sketches made from witness descriptions of two middle-aged men, one believed to be the shooter, the other the driver. But these yielded no immediate matches. The two men wore the same glasses, the same style of beards, and had their hair done in a similar way, suggesting that they may have been members of an organized crime syndicate. Detectives learned from Wheeler's family and colleagues that he had been worried about the Florida operation of his high-lie business. When they dug into this angle, they uncovered evidence of skimming at the company's Connecticut venue. The fraudsters had skimmed money from parking and concessions in a way that pointed to a sophisticated organized fraud. In the early 1980s, the notion that the Boston mob could reach into the heart of Oklahoma seemed far-fetched to some. Despite these suspicions, the case went cold, and a cloud of fear and silence hung over anyone with knowledge. Potential informants were terrified, and for good reason. In the months following Wheeler's death, other gangland executions hinted at a wider issue in the high-lie world. One was Brian Halloran, a low-level Boston criminal who reportedly approached the FBI claiming he had information on Wheeler's slaying and that a man named John Callahan was involved. Halloran was executed on a South Boston waterfront in May 1982, alongside an innocent friend who just happened to give him a ride that night. The other was John Callahan himself, the former president of World High Lie who had sold the business to Roger Wheeler. In August 1982, Callahan's body was found stuffed in the trunk of his Cadillac in a Miami airport parking garage. It appeared that anyone who knew too much about the skimming operation was being systematically eliminated, but unsurprisingly, no one seemed willing to talk about it anymore. As the 1980s progressed, the Roger Wheeler case remained unsolved, frustrating his family and the Tulsa police. Eventually, Tulsa detectives began to suspect that the very people who should have been their allies were hindering the investigation. The FBI had jurisdiction over interstate crime and organized crime, and given the emerging Boston mob connection, one would expect federal agents to be deeply involved in helping Tulsa police. However, they were largely kept in the dark about the investigation. Unbeknownst to Tulsa detectives at the time, this reluctance had a sinister explanation. Agents in the FBI's Boston office were themselves compromised. It later emerged that certain Boston FBI agents had extraordinarily close relationships with Whitey Bulger. Bulger, incredibly, had been acting as an FBI informant since the 1970s, feeding agents information on rival gangs while he was effectively given license to commit crimes. Throughout the investigation, one name kept surfacing: H. Paul Rico, the former FBI agent turned World High Lie security chief. By 1982, Tulsa detectives suspected that Rico might have played a role in Wheeler's demise, and that the FBI may be compromised. That said, at the time, more level-headed investigators in Tulsa dismissed this as a virtual impossibility. As time went on, though, those suspicions were bolstered as the truth about the Winter Hill Gang's infiltration of the FBI trickled out in the late 1990s. John Connolly, a Boston FBI agent who was a handler for Bulger, was arrested and later convicted of multiple charges related to his corruption and protection of Bulger. Investigations by the Justice Department exposed that Bulger had been shielded for years. This shift finally gave the Roger Wheeler case new momentum after almost 2 decades. What had once been dismissed as a crazy theory, that Boston mobsters ordered a hit done in Tulsa and that FBI insiders might have been complicit, was proving to be reality. And with Bulger on the run since 1995 to avoid an indictment, some of his former cronies began to talk, hoping to avoid life, or the chair. The breakthrough in the Wheeler case came as the new millennium dawned. In the late 1990s and 2000, federal prosecutors and investigators managed to flip some key Winter Hill Gang members. One of them was Johnny Martirano, a feared enforcer who had been part of Bulger's inner circle. Martirano had been implicated in a string of gangland slayings. Facing the possibility of the chair or life behind bars, he agreed to cooperate. In a plea deal, Martirano admitted to carrying out over 20 slayings at the behest of the crew, and one of those was Roger Wheeler's. He revealed the chain of events behind it all. Whitey Bulger and his closest allies were alarmed that Wheeler's investigation was getting too close to their skimming operation, and decided that Wheeler had to be eliminated. Martirano flew to Oklahoma under an alias, and it was Rico who helped by providing inside information of the details of Wheeler's habits and schedule. On that fateful day at Southern Hills, Martirano lay in wait and executed the plan. He then slipped away, returned the rental car, and flew out, leaving Tulsa authorities baffled. In March 2001, nearly 20 years after the slaying, a Tulsa grand jury finally indicted all those responsible for the slaying of Roger Wheeler. By that time, 2 other men, allegedly central to the crime, were already dead. By way of refresher, Brian Halloran, the low-level Boston career criminal, had been snuffed out in 1982 on that South Boston shoreline. While John Callahan, the former World High Lie president, was stuffed into a trunk in Miami. Bulger, the mastermind of the operation, was still a fugitive when the indictments came down, and he had slipped away in 1995 after a tip-off about pending charges. Another stunning development was the indictment of former agent Paul Rico in 2003. At age 78, Rico was arrested and charged with aiding in the slaying of Roger Wheeler. Rico maintained his innocence, and he would never face trial. He died of natural causes in 2004 while in custody awaiting proceedings. Notably, Martirano, with 20 bodies to his name, including Roger Wheeler's, was given only a 15-year sentence as part of his plea bargain. In June 2011, 30 years after Roger Wheeler was slain in that Tulsa parking lot, news broke that Whitey Bulger had been captured. He was arrested in Santa Monica, California, where he had been living in hiding with his longtime girlfriend. Bulger's arrest made headlines worldwide after years of being one of the most high-profile wanted people in the country. Federal authorities decided to try all his cases together, as is usual in such complex interjurisdictional matters. In 2013, Whitey Bulger went on trial for the slaying of Roger Wheeler, amongst numerous others. The jury found he had participated in Wheeler's slaying, and he was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years, ensuring the 83-year-old mobster would die in prison. Bulger would go on to meet a violent and horrific end behind bars in 2018 at the hands of his fellow inmates, his life of crime finally having caught up to him in his old age. The Sakara bird is a small, carved wooden object that has captivated historians and aviation enthusiasts alike for over a century. Discovered in 1898 during the excavation of a tomb at Saqqara, this intriguing artifact dates back over 2 millennia to around 200 BC. It resembles a stylized bird, with outstretched wings measuring about 7 centimeters across and a lightweight body weighing less than 1/10 of a pound. Crafted from sturdy sycamore wood and originally mounted on a rod, the figurine immediately stood out as a curious find. At first glance, it seems like a simple bird carving, but its unusually plane-like form has puzzled and inspired speculation ever since. In form, it resembles a bird of prey. The carving is sleek and almost aerodynamic, with flat, horizontal wings as if poised in glide. The head is carved with a hooked beak, reminiscent of a falcon, a creature sacred to the ancient Egyptians. The tail is broad and level, though the artifact notably lacks legs or painted detail. Its craftsmanship is simple yet well proportioned, suggesting the maker had a good sense of balance. Today, this little wooden bird is displayed in Cairo's Egyptian Museum, where its plane-like silhouette continues to fascinate visitors. Visitors can find it on the museum's upper floor among other animal figurines, yet this particular piece stands out as a mystery of its own. Without inscriptions or records, archaeologists have had to speculate on why this miniature bird was made. One idea is that it served a ceremonial or symbolic function. Falcons were sacred in Egypt, representing sky gods like Horus and Ra, so a falcon-shaped figure could have been a ritual object or charm for protection. Another possibility is that it was a toy for a child of the elite. Under this theory, some have even likened it to a form that might glide when thrown, given that ancient Egyptians used such hunting tools for birds. Others suggest it functioned as a weather vane, or was mounted on the front of a sacred boat during religious festivals. Any of these uses might fit its context in the Ptolemaic period, but without definitive evidence, they remain educated guesses. The Sakura bird's fame grew largely due to a controversial idea that it was more than a toy or ritual figurine, that it was actually a model of an ancient Egyptian flying machine. This bold theory took off in the 1960s, when Khalil Massia, an Egyptian physician, suggested the wooden bird was a proof-of-concept glider. He pointed to its wing shape, arguing it could generate lift. The flat top of the tail, he believed, once held a tail stabilizer that later broke off. To test this, Massia built an enlarged replica with an added tail fin, and according to his reports, the model did glide when launched. This claim was met with some skepticism by the aviation community. Unfortunately, others tried to recreate his supposed experiment, and no one else could replicate the results. Aeronautical engineers who analyzed the artifact have noted practical problems. It's too heavy and unbalanced to glide effectively, especially since it lacks a tail rudder for stability. The academic community also greeted this ancient airplane theory with skepticism as well. No depictions or writings from Egypt hint at any attempt to fly, and a lone wooden model isn't proof of lost technology. All evidence to date suggests the artifact was never meant to be a serious flying device, but rather a static object with symbolic or practical purpose. Some fringe theorists even tied the Sakura bird to ancient astronaut myths of extraterrestrial influence. Under this theory, the bird may not be proof that Egyptians themselves had the technology to fly, but may have been their attempt to explain what they saw. As mentioned, the Sakura bird dates to around 200 BC in Ptolemaic Egypt. By this period, Egypt was fully enmeshed in the Hellenistic Mediterranean world. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, had become the intellectual and commercial hub of the region, with the Great Library fostering rapid exchange of ideas and technologies. Had there been genuine evidence of flying machines or extraterrestrial visitors, Greek and Egyptian scholars would surely have recorded it in writings. This was a period where this knowledge would have circulated across Egypt, Greece, and beyond. The complete absence of such accounts in papyri, inscriptions, or classical literature makes the ancient astronaut explanation both unnecessary and unsupported. Despite decades of study, the Sakura bird still remains an Egyptian enigma. That said, all evidence suggests that it was a much more grounded object than some would like to believe.